Hello everybody, James Hancock here. I'm back with some very sad news. I just read over on Variety that Robert Duvall, one of the best actors of his generation, has sadly passed away at the age of 95. His wife apparently announced it over on Facebook with the following quote: "Yesterday we said goodbye to my beloved husband, cherished friend, and one of the greatest actors of our time," she wrote. "Bob passed away peacefully at home, surrounded by love and comfort. To the world, he was an Academy Award-winning actor, a director, a storyteller. To me, he was simply everything." And she continued with, "His passion for his craft was matched only by his deep love for characters, a great meal, and holding court. For each of his many roles, Bob gave everything to his characters and to the truth of the human spirit they represented. In doing so, he leaves something lasting and unforgettable to us all. Thank you for the years of support you showed Bob and for giving us this time in privacy to celebrate the memories he leaves behind." And I can't think of a more fitting tribute to a man who was just a genuine icon. He was part of a generation of filmmakers and actors where we will probably never see a generation of filmmakers and actors like that ever again. And I'm talking about the second golden age of the 1970s. And I'm always kind of waiting, kind of dreading the day of seeing like the announcement that someone like Jack Nicholson has pushed on. And when Jack Nicholson dies, I will basically cry for the rest of my life. But Robert Duvall, holy shit. He was an absolute icon where basically from the early 60s through basically till a couple days ago, he was one of the best ever to do it. And so I have nothing prepared for this video, so it's going to seem a little more sloppy than my usual content, and I'll probably stutter a little bit more and just kind of ramble a little bit more. But I think the best thing I can do is just pay tribute to the man himself by celebrating his work. So I'm just going to go to the bottom of his IMDb profile, start at the beginning, work my way up, and anytime I come across a show or movie that he was a part of where I feel like it was a big part of my life, I will slow down and celebrate it. And hopefully, for all the youngins out there in their teens and 20s who are like, who's Robert Duvall? Well, this is the video for you because I'm going to tell you who he is and some of the shows and movies that I would recommend you check out if you want to see him doing what he did better than just about anybody else.
What do you mean you don't know where he is? The son of a bitch is a hit, goddammit! Over 2,000 phone calls! Go down to the mailroom. As of this minute, over 14,000 telegrams. The response is sensational. Herb, tell him. Herb's phone hasn't stopped ringing. Every goddamn affiliate from Albuquerque to Sandusky, the response is sensational.
Now, I'm seeing here over on IMDb that he's got 146 acting credits. I will not pretend to have seen all of his shows and movies. I won't pretend to have seen half of his shows and movies. But I have a feeling that when it comes to the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, I've seen the great majority of the good ones. But yeah, maybe as I go through the list, I'll see a few blind spots, the movies that I've been intending to watch for a long time that'll finally give myself the kick in the pants that I need to check them out. But let's start with the earliest movie that I've seen him in, and that would be To Kill a Mockingbird, which I have here on DVD from 1962, where he played Boo Radley. And To Kill a Mockingbird is one of those books where I read it in 8th grade as part of an English class, and then I think I read it again as a sophomore or a junior. But it was a major book that was on all the required reading lists back in the 80s and 90s. And the movie is pretty goddamn good. And everybody remembers Gregory Peck in To Kill a Mockingbird, and he's fantastic as Atticus. And a little random fact not related to Robert Duvall, but in the comics, in DC Comics, Clark Kent's favorite movie is To Kill a Mockingbird. So if you love Superman and you want to know like what are his formative influences, definitely check out To Kill a Mockingbird. But Robert Duvall, he doesn't really show up until the very end, but Boo Radley, he's this kind of mythic figure throughout the book as well as the movie where all the kids play games like, oh, Boo Radley's going to get you. And then when he shows up at the very end, for small spoiler alert, like for a pretty heroic moment, it's an incredible star turn, and that was when I think he popped up on the radar for a lot of people. But prior to that, he had been in episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which I should probably definitely hunt those down. But his very first credit was the Robert Harridge Theater, a TV series from 1960. Oh, and he also appeared in the Armstrong Circle Theater, which is a show from 1959 and 1960. These are TV series that I've never heard of, but in any case, if you're going to start somewhere, To Kill a Mockingbird is an excellent place to start. But then he popped up on an episode of The Untouchables. I should definitely hunt that down. He was in an episode of The Twilight Zone. I don't even know if I've seen that episode or not, but I love watching old school episodes of The Twilight Zone. He was in The Outer Limits, which is another essential sci-fi show. But then the next thing that I've seen him in was The Chase from 1966, and I don't really recall The Chase all that well. I remember Marlon Brando kind of chewing the scenery, and I remember Robert Redford and Jane Fonda. I barely remember Robert Duvall even in it, but it's a movie by Arthur Penn. That's a movie I'm probably long overdue in revisiting. But throughout the 1960s, he continued to do a ton of work in TV with shows like Combat and The Wild Wild West. But I'm just going to scroll up. The next movie that I saw him in was Bullitt from 1968, where he plays a cab driver named Weisberg. And obviously, when people talk about Bullitt, all they talk about is that goddamn Mustang and that fucking car chase, and justifiably so. That car chase sequence is the stuff of movie-making legend, and it's easily one of the best car chases in any movie ever made. But maybe that car chase can act as like the bait or an incentive to get people to go back and watch Bullitt so they can see Robert Duvall playing Weisberg, the cab driver. I barely remember him in the movie, but where I do remember him is in True Grit from 1969 as Ned Pepper. And I've read True Grit, I've seen the 1969 movie, and I've seen the, it's not a remake, but a fresh adaptation by the Coen brothers, which came much later. He's phenomenal in Ned Pepper, where you get to see Robert Duvall going up against John Wayne. And what's interesting is, anytime we have kind of like a passing of the baton or a passing of the torch to the next generation, it's interesting seeing the old Titans going like kind of locking horns with the new Titans. And obviously John Wayne is one of the stars of the true golden age of Hollywood, the 1930s, 40s, and early 50s. But by the late 60s, John Wayne was getting a little heavy and a little long in the tooth. And there's this great scene toward the end where Robert Duvall says something like, "That's bold talk for a one-eyed fat man." John Wayne puts the reins for his horse in his teeth, and he rides into battle, shooting with both hands. It's fantastic stuff. But I always like seeing these movies where, a badass from a previous generation has to kind of, go to war with a badass from the next generation. Because when it comes to the 60s and the 70s, and whether you want to call it the new Hollywood or the film school generation, or there are a lot of different ways of describing this period. For me, the new Hollywood was more people like Mike Nichols or Arthur Penn or Robert Altman or Sam Peckinpah, whereas the film school generation were quite literally the film school generation of people like John Carpenter and Francis Ford Coppola and George Lucas and John Milius and people like that, people who went to film school and then went off and made movies. But there's a lot of blurring of the lines between the new Hollywood and the film school generation. But Robert Duvall was a huge part of it because he would work with Francis Ford Coppola over and over and over again. And he has an incredible role in The Rain People from 1969. And The Rain People at times is a bit somber and a bit dreary, and it can drag a little bit, and it's kind of depressing. But there's one scene where the movie really comes to life, where Robert Duvall brings a woman back to his trailer to get it on. But he's a single father, and he's got a little girl who's a little bit more than he can handle, and she wants to watch, and she won't go to bed, and he's chasing her around trying to spank her and telling her, basically he's desperate just to try to get some special alone time with his date, but his daughter just keeps cock-blocking him over and over and over again. It's absolutely fucking hysterical, but let's scroll up. Oh, MASH, 1970. Speaking of new Hollywood and film school generation, he switches gears from Coppola to working with Robert Altman. And I know a lot of people think that MASH has humor that is inappropriate or offensive or whatever the case might be. I think it's fucking hysterical. And the character of Robert Duvall is oftentimes the butt of the jokes because he's a very sincere, devout person. And he's in a camp of people who are basically like, just total fucking hellraisers and drunkards and adulterers and so on and so forth. So if you want to see where the legendary career of Robert Altman really got underway, it's with MASH, and Robert Duvall was a huge part of that. And basically from this point throughout the rest of the 1970s, over and over and over again, he just continues to work with some of the best filmmakers of his generation, which leads us to THX 1138 from 1971, where he got to be the star for George Lucas. And for fans of Star Wars, and if they hear, oh, George Lucas made a science fiction movie in the early 70s, I'm going to check that out. I get to see more lightsabers and more force. No, THX 1138 is a very different movie. It's based on a short film he made, very experimental, very avant-garde, and definitely not commercial at all. But if you want to see what George Lucas's career might have been had he not suddenly exploded with success when he made American Graffiti and Star Wars, well, then it gives you an idea of what his initial goals were before he got a little taste of all that money and decided to take his career in another direction. But Robert Duvall, obviously, a massive part of THX 1138. And then in 1972, we have this teeny tiny little obscure movie that nobody's ever heard of, talking about The Godfather, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, a strong contender for the most entertaining movie ever made by any filmmaker. And Robert Duvall plays Tom Hagen, who's a child who's been adopted by the Corleones. He's basically a part of the family, but he's obviously not related by blood, which always creates a little bit of a divide where he really wants to be thought of as like a real brother by Michael Corleone, but he's much closer with Sonny, and Sonny's the one who brought him home. But Tom Hagen, even though he's not part of the family, he's their consigliere. He's kind of their master strategist. But what's interesting with Tom Hagen is how they keep saying you're not a wartime consigliere, and they kind of push him to the side during wartime. But when it comes to business, yeah, he knows what he's doing. And very famously, he's got all the scenes early on where he's trying to get Johnny Fontane some movie role out in Hollywood. And he goes out to meet with some big studio head, and they have drinks and they're having polite conversation and so on and so forth. But when this guy keeps turning him down, Robert Duvall very politely, like, thank you for a very pleasant evening, and leaves. And the next thing you know, that studio head wakes up with a horse head in his bed. And the message is clear. Yeah, Johnny Fontane is going to get that role. And so I think at that point, whether people had seen any of his previous roles or not, suddenly everybody knew precisely who Robert Duvall was, and they would know who he was for the rest of their lives, because he would go on to be in The Godfather Part 2. And I think one of the main reasons The Godfather Part 3 is so much weaker than The Godfather 1 and 2. First and foremost, Francis Ford Coppola was no longer the man that he was. But Robert Duvall's not in it. And I can't remember why Robert Duvall's not in it. Maybe it was like an issue of money or scheduling conflict. Who knows? But in the absence of Tom Hagen, the Godfather franchise just is not the same thing. But moving on to 1972, we have a Western double feature where he appeared in both The Great Northfield Minnesota Raid as well as Joe Kidd. And I discovered The Great Northfield Minnesota Raid through my friend David Lambert, who's just a Western like savant. He's a total psycho about the Western genre, but I'd never heard of it until he exposed me to it. But he plays Jesse James in it. We did a podcast basically about every movie involving the character of Jesse James. And if memory serves, he's one of the villains in Joe Kidd. But I have not watched the Joe Kidd since like 1996. I saw it on VHS a million years ago. I owned the VHS. The only scene that I can really remember is when some villain is talking shit to Clint Eastwood, and Clint Eastwood says, "That knife's gonna look awful funny sticking out of your ass." And it just, it still makes you laugh. I saw it like 30 years ago, so I do need to revisit Joe Kidd. But The Great Northfield Minnesota Raid I've seen more recently. But if you're a fan of Westerns, or even if you're not a fan of Westerns, definitely take those for a spin. But in 1973, we get one of the big ones. A movie that I just saw for the first time fairly recently, The Outfit, which is based on this book. Wow. Wow. I don't know why I need to, anyway, it's here. But
The Outfit. Put your hands flat on the table.
But The Outfit's based on the third book in the Parker series by Donald E. Westlake, who wrote under the name Richard Stark. And I first discovered this movie when I was reading Cinema Speculation by Quentin Tarantino. And I guess when I think of the character Parker, it's very tough not to associate him with the character with Lee Marvin, who played him in Point Blank. And he's so good as Parker in Point Blank. As I read the first 3 books in the Parker series, I kept hearing Lee Marvin's voice and kind of picturing Lee Marvin in my mind. But Robert Duvall, he's a pretty goddamn good Parker as well, and you could argue that when it comes to the style and tone of the movie compared to the original source material, perhaps John Flynn did a better job with The Outfit than John Borman did with Point Blank. But you really can't go wrong with either of them. They both seriously kick ass. I had a few problems with The Outfit in terms of some of the ingredients that they added to the story that I didn't think needed to be there. But yeah, if you just want to see Robert Duvall fucking with gangsters and kicking their ass and just like, abusing them and pistol whipping and shooting them through their hands and just doing all sorts of horrible stuff, it's awesome. I mean, it's a mean and nasty action flick from the 1970s. It's the kind of mean and nasty action movies that have not been made in quite some time. Just the 70s, people were just savages back in the 1970s. No matter what genre they were working in, they just made their movies as rough and gnarly and nasty as humanly possible. And what's crazy is how in 1974, not only did Robert Duvall make The Outfit, he also made The Conversation as well as The Godfather Part 2. So I was like, slow down. Like you're making too many all-time classic movies in too short a time. Like we can't handle this much greatness. But The Conversation, he plays a smaller role, but it's easily Francis Ford Coppola's most personal, most experimental movie. And I think one of his best movies. Definitely in his top 3. Usually when people are talking about Francis Ford Coppola and their favorite movies, they always talk about Apocalypse Now, the first 2 Godfathers, and The Conversation. And you can kind of order them however you like, but in any case. In the 1970s, Francis Ford Coppola made 4 movies, and they're 4 of the best movies ever made. And Robert Duvall is in each and every single one of them. So he's part of the magic mixture that made Coppola so good back then. So if you've not seen The Conversation, definitely take it for a spin. And in The Godfather Part 2, Duvall gets to have a little bit of a larger role than he did in the first one, because obviously in the absence of Marlon Brando and James Caan, you just don't have it as many of like the core original characters anymore. So John Cazale and Al Pacino and Robert Duvall take center stage more frequently. And yeah, I mean, for me, The Godfather 1 and 2 are almost like kind of like one big movie where it's impossible for me to separate them in my mind. But if you were to ask, like, what is the greatest movie franchise of all time, I think The Godfather is a strong contender on that front.
They shot Sonny on the causeway. He's dead.
But moving right along, earlier I mentioned how throughout the 1970s, Robert Duvall kept working with some of the best filmmakers who ever lived. And that streak continued when he got a chance to work with Sam Peckinpah, one of my all-time favorite filmmakers, on the movie The Killer Elite. Now, is The Killer Elite remotely on the level of Sam Peckinpah's best work? Movies like, Straw Dogs or The Wild Bunch or Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid or The Ballad of Cable Hogue or any of his great movies you care to mention? Absolutely not. But it's a pretty mean and nasty, very cool little down and dirty action movie which reunites James Caan and Robert Duvall once again playing a villain. It's funny, I always think of Robert Duvall as like everybody's favorite uncle or everybody's favorite grandfather. Basically Gus McCrae from Lonesome Dove, where everybody just wants to pull up a chair next to the fire and just listen to him tell stories all night. But throughout the 1970s, he played the villain. Like feels like more often than not. But if you're a fan of Sam Peckinpah, and if you're not, like, what's wrong with you? Like, watch all of his movies and then watch them again and again and again. But The Killer Elite is worth a look, but only after you've seen all of Sam Peckinpah's essentials. But the next movie, it's one of the big dogs and one of my all-time favorite movies. And I'll be doing a deep dive on it later this year because the 50th anniversary is coming up in November. But we're talking about Network from 1976. And basically it's William Holden and Faye Dunaway and Robert Duvall and Peter Finch just delivering like a sermon on the craft of acting. But it's also one of the most aggressive, mean and nasty movies about corporate warfare and corporate culture in the world of entertainment and television that will ever be made. But it's also a brilliant social satire. But I mentioned earlier how Robert Duvall kept working with great directors, like Robert Altman, Francis Ford Coppola, Sam Peckinpah, etc. Here, he got to work with the great Sidney Lumet. Just insane how good a decade the 1970s was overall, but also just how great a decade the 1970s was for Robert Duvall's career. But Network, it's a strong contender for one of the best movies that I've ever seen from any era, from any country. I just love it to pieces. I have no idea how many times I've seen it. But one of my favorite scenes is when basically Robert Duvall is explaining how he's basically bulletproof because he's got a hit TV show in his hands, and that he can get away with murder moving forward. But it's like, I have a hit. It's a hit. It's a big tittied hit. And the way he says it, oh my God, it always just makes me fall to pieces. But his name is Frank Hackett, which is very similar to like Hatchet, but he is like the ultimate corporate hatchet man. If you want to see Robert Duvall at his most vicious, watch Network, and you can thank me later.
It's a big, fat, big-titted hit, and I don't have to waffle around with Ruddy anymore. If he wants to take me up before the CCA board, let him.
But also in the same year, The Eagle Has Landed, a killer World War II movie. I can't remember what role he played in. I've only seen that movie one time, but it's worth a look if you love kind of old-fashioned World War II movies where they have like 50 stars. But it's got Michael Caine and Donald Sutherland and a bunch of other great actors. What else do we got in here? And I realize I'm skipping a ton of great movies. Some of which I've seen and I'm just not diving into. Some of which are still in my must-watch list. But in 1978, I didn't even realize this. Apparently, he plays an uncredited priest on swing in the remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And Invasion of the Body Snatchers is one of those. It's part of that rare club of remakes that are well worth watching in the world of science fiction. And obviously, you can talk about like The Blob or The Fly or The Thing. There's some good remakes out there, and Invasion of the Body Snatchers is one of the good ones. But in any case, I didn't know that Robert Duvall was in it, but that's just yet another feather in his cap. But now let's talk about arguably his most famous role, or like one of the biggest feathers in his cap, and that would be Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore in Apocalypse Now. And just to give you an idea of how memorable Robert Duvall is in the movie, walk up to anybody, whether they've seen the movie or not, and say, give me a quote from Apocalypse Now. And I guarantee you, whether they've seen it 100 times or 0 times, they're going to say, I love the smell of napalm in the morning. And that is John Milius. Like, the early part of the screenplay much more closely resembles John Milius's original screenplay when George Lucas was going to direct it as like a mean and nasty, down and dirty, super cheap, black and white kind of guerrilla warfare movie. And John Milius, I guess as the movie kept, like they kept shooting it for years and years and years and running into all these problems, John Milius' screenplay kind of like, it became more like the source material Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, but also it just became this strange movie toward the end where Marlon Brando is just kind of improvising and riffing and just making up the story as he went. And Francis Ford Coppola was like, yeah, like just keep going. But if you love John Milius' writing, and if you love his movies like, Red Dawn and Conan the Barbarian and any of the movies that he made throughout the 1970s and 1980s, or even his later shows like Rome, I feel like John Milius, one of the best examples of him putting his best foot forward, is with the character of Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore. And Robert Duvall, he was just born to play that role. There's this great bit where Martin Sheen's looking over at him and talking about how he's almost got like this bulletproof aura around him where he loves looking after his boys, and you just have this feeling that he's going to get through the war without even getting a scratch. And he's the only person who seems to be having a really good time over in Vietnam, where he's like, someday this war is going to end. And he seems so bitter about it because what he likes to do, he likes flying around in helicopters and taking over beaches and surfing. That's his big thing. And there's like almost no good places to surf in all of Vietnam. But when he hears that there's a great, can't remember how they describe it, but there's a great place to surf at this place where Martin Sheen needs to get. And he's like, all right, Charlie, don't surf. And they go off and they take that beach. And it is by far the most thrilling scene in that movie, and easily one of the most thrilling action scenes or scenes about warfare in the history of movies. Some might even argue maybe when you're talking about the Vietnam War, you shouldn't make any sequence as thrilling as that one, but Francis Ford Coppola and D.P. Vittorio Storaro and all these actors, they just couldn't help themselves. They gave us an action scene for the ages, and Robert Duvall is what makes that scene work so fucking well. But the way I feel about the 1970s is very similar to how Colonel Kilgore feels about the Vietnam War. It's like, someday this war's going to end. And with the 1970s, inevitably you get to a point where you just run out of movies from the 1970s to see. But there's one more I want to mention starring Robert Duvall, and that would be The Great Santini from 1979. Well, we're seeing it gets kind of overshadowed by Apocalypse Now, but he's a huge part of it. And then Robert Duvall starts working a little bit less frequently, but when he shows up with maximum impact. I've never seen Tender Mercies, but apparently that one's worth seeing. But he pops up in The Natural, starring Robert Redford, R.I.P. Robert Redford. I should have made a video like this for Robert Redford when he died last year, but I just didn't have the time. But The Natural, if you like movies about sports, yeah, The Natural is one of the best ever. What else did we got from the 1980s? All right, Lonesome Dove. It's 4 episodes. It's a TV miniseries. And TV in the 1980s was a very different beast from TV in the 21st century. I feel like The Sopranos changed everything for all time, where every TV show since The Sopranos owes a debt of gratitude to The Sopranos, where if you wish to, not everybody chooses to, but if you wish to, you can write and direct TV episodes with the same craft and attention to detail that you would a great movie. But Lonesome Dove, when you're talking about TV from the 1980s, is easily one of the best shows of that period. And the reason it's still so good is because of Robert Duvall and Tommy Lee Jones as Woodrow Call and Gus McCrae. And I've got Lonesome Dove right here, which I've read twice. And the reason I've read it twice is because Robert Duvall is so fucking funny as Gus McCrae. It'll make you want to read the book and basically do nothing but read the book for the rest of your life.
Besides the whiskey, I think will require a little respect. I'm Captain Augustus McCrae. This is Captain Woodrow F. Call. Now, if you care to turn around, you can see how we looked when we was younger, and the people around here wanted to make us senators.
And the legacy of Lonesome Dove is still being felt all these years later because Taylor Sheridan, who's arguably the most successful and prolific writer-producer in all of television, this is his favorite show. He absolutely loves it. And it's the reason he became a writer and a director and an actor and a filmmaker and a TV producer. And I was watching an interview with him with Joe Rogan where he said when he watched this show at an impressionable young age, he just said, I want to do that. And he didn't quite know what he meant at the time, but he just knew everything about it, from the authenticity and like the flavor of the dialogue and the acting. You got Danny Glover and Diane Lane and Robert Urich, Frederick Forrest, Ricky Schroeder, and just Angelica Houston. Just like, it's just a laundry list of some of the best actors of that time. But Robert Duvall, he steals each and every single scene in which he appears, and he's got Tommy Lee Jones by his side in pretty much every single scene, except for the scenes where he goes to visit Lorena Wood, played by Diane Lane. And I know some people get uncomfortable when they hear about older people who still enjoy getting it on from time to time. But Gus McCrae, as he famously says, the older the violin, the sweeter the music. And he loves nothing more than a good poke. And he's got all these card tricks and games that he likes to play with Lorena Wood, where she's constantly like turning him down. Even though she's a prostitute, she's trying to spend all of her time with Jake. But Augusta's like, well, you can spend all the time with Jake you want. That doesn't mean I can't, have a poke from time to time. And some of the most hilarious scenes in television history are where he's basically kind of like tricking her into offering him one more poke. And anyway, those scenes between Robert Duvall and Diane Lane are utterly charming. And there's another great scene where he's trying to seduce her by a river. And he's like, well, why don't you just treat me like your whore? And she's like, well, what are you talking about? And he's playing some game where he has her like close her eyes, and he's trying to strip down before something happens. Anyway, he ends up like picking her up, taking her to the river, but that's when they see blue duck on the horizon, and that's when the story gets much more serious. And he's like, yeah, Lorena, go get me my gun belt, because I see somebody up on the ridge, and I don't know if he's friendly. And the way Robert Duvall delivers these scenes, it's just peak Robert Duvall. Or the scene where they go to a saloon, and the bartender's not giving him like sufficient respect, and Robert Duvall just like smashes his face, throws a glass up in the air, shoots it out of the sky, because Gus McCrae, even though he's old, he has a superb eyesight. It's one of his greatest assets, and Woodrow Call, he's always getting pissed off that Robert Duvall or Gus McCrae sees so well. Anyway, I should probably do like a flashback review at some point of both the novel Lonesome Dove as well as the show, and I should recruit my friend David Lambert to be a part of it, because I feel like that would be one hell of a video to make. But when it comes to kind of, I won't say late period Robert Duvall, but the latter part of his career, it's tough to beat Lonesome Dove. And I don't think anybody out there is ever going to say that Robert Duvall's work in the 80s and 90s can rival his work in the 1970s, but he was still doing good work, like Colors in 1988, that's well worth seeing, or Days of Thunder in 1990. It's a pretty ridiculous movie in a lot of ways, but when people talk about Days of Thunder, usually what they'll bring up is one of the scenes with Robert Duvall and how good he was. Like when Tom Cruise's character is talking about somebody hitting him on the racetrack, he's like, he didn't hit you, he didn't nudge you, he rubbed you, and rubbin's racing. And it's something about the way he says rubbin's racing. Once again, if people ask you, like, or if you ask anybody, give me a quote from Days of Thunder, they're probably going to say rubbin's racing. And so Robert Duvall, if he's famous for anything, it's for delivering the most iconic lines of dialogue in all the movies in which he appears. But let's scroll through the 90s. Oh, Falling Down, 1993. It's ridiculous how many good movies he's in. But he's playing the cop that's hunting down Michael Douglas as he goes on his rampage throughout Falling Down. That movie is also 100% worth hunting down. Geronimo, an American Legend, another Western to his name. The Paper. You know what? Just to have one word of criticism in this video, The Paper might be the one role with Robert Duvall where I didn't like his performance. He's kind of doing this caricature of like a dying newspaperman who has like a really strange specific accent. I think he's got like a tumor in his colon, if memory serves, and he's like, I gotta walk or I'll die. But when you hear Robert Duvall speak, I always like Robert Duvall when he's doing kind of that laid-back Southern drawl. If he's trying to do something else, maybe he's not necessarily good at doing accents, but most people aren't good at doing accents. But yeah, that's my one negative or one knock. Sling Blade, 1996, which that was Billy Bob Thornton's first big claim to fame. And Billy Bob Thornton, I would never say he's on the level of Robert Duvall, but maybe that's a movie where like one Southern gentleman is kind of passing the baton to the next Southern gentleman. And Robert, obviously, Billy Bob Thornton is still going strong with Landman, who obviously that's a show that's created by Taylor Sheridan. Taylor Sheridan's creating that show because he loved Lonesome Dove. So yeah, Robert Duvall's there's all these there's a lot of, I guess, connective tissue between all these kind of Southern boys who enjoy telling these kinds of stories. The Apostle, 1997. If memory serves, Duvall directed that one. Let me just confirm. Yes, he did. I saw that in the theater. It's very religious. And for a lot of people, they're not going to be into that. But if you want to see Robert Duvall leaning into, there's some crazy scenes where he's driving along and just preaching while his mom is singing, and I was like, wow, like it's the real deal, the genuine article. And Robert Duvall, he just, I don't want to get too sidetracked about the plot of The Apostle, but there's some incredible scenes where he'll sit in the attic. He's not really praying, but he's kind of screaming at God. And somebody calls to complain about the noise, and his mother explains to the person on the phone, well, sometimes he talks to God, and sometimes he talks at him. And tonight's one of those nights where he talks at him. Wild movie. And is that the only movie that he ever directed? Let me just double check real quick. We're doing a little free flow form here. Sorry, as I'm kind of navigating around. All right, actor, producer, director. So the movies he directed were Not the Jet Set from 1974. Never even heard of that. 1983, Angelo, My Love. The Apostle, 1997. Assassination Tango from 2002. And Wild Horses from 2015. So he's got 5 movies to his name. All right, so what else do we got? Throughout the late 1990s, he stayed very active. He's a little bit like Harvey Keitel. Like in the late 90s, a lot of actors who had gotten their start in their 70s became just these massive stars. Whether you're talking about Dennis Hopper or Christopher Walken. Actually, Dennis Hopper got a start in the 50s. But a lot of these old school actors, they had these legendary reputations, and a lot of directors were very eager to work with them. So Robert Duvall, he pops up again in The Gingerbread Man, which reunited him with Robert Altman. He was in Deep Impact, which I never saw. I saw Armageddon, and at that time, Deep Impact and Armageddon were basically roughly the same movie and came out at the same time, and I chose Armageddon over Deep Impact. Saw him in A Civil Action, the Steve Zalian movie. It's more of like a John Travolta movie, but if you like legal dramas, Civil Action. Then Robert Duvall got back into Days of Thunder territory with Gone in 60 Seconds, and that was the first time where I started to feel like, you know what, Robert Duvall at this point is starting to maybe collect one too many paychecks that he shouldn't be collecting, because he's starting to appear in a lot of trashy movies. But I feel like if you're a living legend and you have all these incredible movies to your name, you're allowed to chase a few paychecks in your waning years, because you've got kids and grandkids and you want to leave something behind for them and that sort of thing. And it's around this time, or maybe 1 or 2 years later, where I had my one encounter where I saw Robert Duvall in public. I was on a date, and I was at some bar at the bottom of a hotel in L.A., and the girl was with said, "Oh my God, that's Robert Duvall." I was like, whoa. And there he was down at the end of the bar, looking just like he did in Gone in 60 Seconds, and I was just absolutely petrified. I wish I'd gone over and just said, "Robert Duvall, you don't have to say a word, just thank you." I wish I'd had the courage. I was way too starstruck, way too intimidated, and so I just that was my near miss with encountering the great Robert Duvall. But then we have him in The Sixth Day, one of Arnie's lesser-known movies, but he's still working with Arnold Schwarzenegger. John Q, where he's united with Denzel Washington. Gods and Generals, which is based on the sequel to The Killer Angels. He plays Robert E. Lee. I like The Killer Angels. I never read Gods and Generals, which was written by the son of the author of The Killer Angels. The Killer Angels is one of the best novels I've ever read, but it's about the Battle of Gettysburg. But after he died, his son decided to continue the story. I can't remember I think the movie adaptation of The Killer Angels was just called Gettysburg, but it was it's like a pale shade compared to the original book. But in that, Robert Duvall plays Robert E. Lee in Gods and Generals. I might have to take it for a spin and just see what he had to offer. What else? Kicking and Screaming, 2005. Not the Kicking and Screaming from the 1990s, created by Noah Baumbach. Sorry, I had a brain fart there. Noah Baumbach made the good Kicking and Screaming from the 1990s, but I never saw the 2005 Kicking and Screaming. I think it's a soccer movie with like Will Ferrell coaching little girls. In any case, Thank You for Smoking from 2005. I think that's the best movie by, what the fuck's his name? Getting old, getting senile. Jason Reitman. Jason Reitman, I feel like he's one of those filmmakers where every time he makes a movie, he gets worse. But when he made Thank You for Smoking, everybody's like, oh my God, Jason Reitman, it's going to be the next big thing. But Robert Duvall is in that. Oh, he appears as Tom Hagen in the video game for The Godfather. He did the voice for Tom Hagen in 2006. And then he did it again for The Godfather Mob Wars. I guess we're starting to get into the period where he started to make a lot more forgettable movies, but every once in a while he'd pop up with something cool or something interesting, like We Own the Night. Oh my God, The Road. The Road is so traumatizing. I don't think I've ever actually seen the movie all the way through, because I read the novel by Cormac McCarthy, and it's one of those novels where I was hanging upon every word, totally riveted, totally spellbound, but it's so dark. and so bleak and so depressing. It's one of those things where you never want to experience the story ever again. And only Cormac McCarthy can tell a story that grim and that bleak and that depressing. But Robert Duvall plays the old man in The Road. Pitch perfect casting. I mean, the world of Cormac McCarthy and Robert Duvall, his gravitas, they go together hand in glove. So I should revisit that. But I'm definitely never... I think I got the book, The Road, somewhere around here. Yep, there it is. The Road, Cormac McCarthy. Dude, this shit is fucking savage. Maybe not as, like, outright, like, you know, just like kind of awe-inspiring as Blood Meridian. But if you just want to feel suicidal for a couple hours while you read a book, yeah, read The Road. But I'm just scrolling up a bit. Hemingway and Gellhorn, I barely remember, but I did watch that on HBO. Robert Duvall's in Jack Reacher, not the show The Reacher on Amazon, but the original attempt at the franchise with Tom Cruise. They made 2. Anything else I want to call attention to? No, I think that about cuts it. So, yeah, Robert Duvall, I mean, what can I say? I don't want to start bawling and weeping about what a profound impact he had, but I could not be more deadly serious when I talk about how that generation of actors and filmmakers and writers from the 1970s, it truly was a second golden age for Hollywood. And a big part of that was the influx of a lot of European talent like Laszlo Kovacs and a lot of these DPs who brought a lot of European sensibilities. I feel like Hollywood's always at its best when it collaborates with a lot of the best filmmakers from other parts of the world, where suddenly guys like Roman Polanski, who is Polish, is working in Hollywood. And you just need to have... Hollywood needs more than just Hollywood in order to put its best foot forward. But a lot of these filmmakers in the 1970s have been inspired by European art house filmmaking of the 60s, people like Antonioni and Bergman and Truffaut and Godard. And there was just something in the water at the time where they were just making some of the best movies ever made. And so whether you want to talk about filmmakers like Scorsese and Coppola or actors like Jack Nicholson, Robert Duvall was a massive part of what made that decade so special. He appeared in several of the best movies ever made, brought his A game every time, never phoned anything in, and he just had a specific style and delivery of acting that is unlike any other actor who's ever lived before or since, and the world will be poorer in his absence. He will be dearly missed. And yeah, thank you so much for listening to me as I ramble today, just celebrating the career of one of the best people ever to do it. Goddamn, he's just a true fucking legend. But he got to live to a ripe old age. He lived from 1931 during the Great Depression up through 2026. We should all be so lucky. He lived the life of 100 men. And I imagine that his family is going to miss him dearly. But if you are a youngin' out there and have not seen a lot of old movies, I hope I put a few interesting movies on your radar. And if there's something amazing that he was in that I did not mention today, because there are plenty of movies that I forgot to mention. I'm just seeing now. I've still got IMDb open, and all these movies are popping up. Open Range was one that I should have mentioned as well. It's not as good as some of the other great westerns that came out like in the distant past. But if you want to see him working alongside Kevin Costner, yeah, Open Range is absolutely worth a look. He's kind of doing his Gus McCrae routine a little bit, so you might even say it's a little bit like self-parody, but Robert Duvall and Kevin Costner, they make a good team, and Kevin Costner directed that one, so yeah. At this point, I'm officially babbling and rambling. If you're going to watch Robert Duvall in a Western, obviously watch Lonesome Dove, but he made some good ones in the 1970s as well. But if you've never read Lonesome Dove, if you do, when you read it, every time Gus McCrae has a line of dialogue, you will hear Robert Duvall's voice in your head, and people still to this day buy what they call the Gus hat because they just want to wear that hat that Robert Duvall wore in that show. But thank you so much for listening to me. I hope I paid sufficient tribute to the great man. If you like this video, please leave a comment below or like, subscribe, hit that notification bell. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.